Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. Brian here. And today we are discussing ERVs, what evolution is called endogenous retroviruses. I had a wonderful interview with Donny Budinsky from Standing for Truth Ministries. He's pretty much made himself an expert on ERVs. As he said in one discussion, I believe he said that and for like, I don't know, was it a year or a couple years, made himself he said he'll eat, sleep, and breathe ERVs. So, as he put it, he studied the concept very much, and so he's got a whole presentation and to play for us. And we had some technical difficulties trying to get off the ground with it, but eventually we were able to get to it. And he had some wonderful things to say and a lot of good information as well. So stay tuned. We're going to do our presentation of ERVs on here on the Genesis series. All right, we're here with Donny Budinsky from Standing for Truth Ministries, and he is going to be talking to us today about ERVs. And Donny, could you do a quick introduction to yourself, and then whenever you want to, just go ahead and jump into what you got for us?
Well, Brian, as always, it is a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate the work you're doing here at Apologetics 101. You put on some excellent interviews. You're always very professional and comprehensive. And we love the same topics, my brother. So I'm happy to be here. My name is Donny Budinsky. I run the Standing for Truth Ministries. We're a full-time biblical creation ministry. We also host debates, interviews. I do a yearly conference. We've written and put out numerous books, articles. And so, yeah, we focus on a lot of things. I like to leave no stone unturned, especially when it comes to the world of creation. I've written a book going back a couple years ago now, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. Many proponents or defenders of common descent believe that ERVs are essentially irrefutable evidence that you and I, Brian, are related to chimpanzees and dogs. And so I'm excited to discuss ERVs tonight with you.
Right. And I actually have that book on PDF and on Word. 'Cause I put it in Word formats because that's why I usually put it. It's just easier for me to find things
Yeah.
and examine it. I was reading it today actually. And so I would recommend that book. I'm Is it available on Amazon or your book?
It is. Yeah, you can go right to the website, standfortruthministries.com. I am currently updating the website, actually, just putting more content on there for people. And so if they go right to the website, you'll see a lot of the books that we've written and sell. You click it, it'll take you right to the Amazon page.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. And I will be linking Donnie's website in the description box below. Okay, go ahead, Donnie, with what you got for us.
Okay. Well, Brian, I'm excited to, as I said earlier, be here. And what I'll do is set the foundation by going over some visuals and slides. So I want to treat this like people haven't heard of ERVs before. This might be people's first time. Here we go. We'll go. Okay. So it's a technical topic. And as we know in science, we don't prove things. And when it comes to ERVs, though, many apologists of evolution, they have argued that the evidence from endogenous retroviruses is as close to proof as you're going to get for evolution. So what I like to focus on, as you know, Brian, we've done shows together on what? Junk DNA and chromosome 2 fusion. And so when you look up what evolutionists believe are the best lines of evidence for their position, what you'll typically find are evidence from the world of genetics that comprise ERVs, pseudogenes, junk DNA in general, and chromosome 2 fusion. And so that's why I've decided to focus on those pieces of evidence and those topics. I want to see what the evolutionist thinks are the best lines of evidence for why they are related to whales and strawberries, and then engage those lines of evidence. So there are a lot of arguments that the evolutionary community look to that are just simply agnostic, or they don't really help us in moving forward with the origins debate. And so those lines of evidence, and we've touched on this too in the past, I've done full presentations on this, comprise homology, nested hierarchies, so-called transitional forms. One example, homology, the shared structures in the biological world. The argument also applies to the world of genetics, shared genetic sequences or DNA units or genetic markers between creatures. And so these lines of evidence are largely agnostic or non-differentiating. What I mean by that, Brian, is if I were to tell you, hey, creation's true because the sky is blue, or creation's true because the earth is round. Well, an evolutionist would say, no, the evolutionary model can also explain why the sky is blue or the earth is round. That's not providing us with discriminatory lines of evidence. That's not helping us truly answer this question of ancestry. And so what I like to focus on is those lines of evidence that can help us answer the question of ancestry. And so I think it largely comes down to DNA function, and it largely comes down to countering their so-called best lines of evidence. So as you can see here on the slide, Brian, my brother, we got endogenous retroviruses, chromosome 2 fusion, and pseudogenes. So far with you, we've done shows together on chromosome 2 fusion, incredibly comprehensive. I think we've done at least two. The second one was a thorough response to the critics, Getz Gibbon and Ruhif. I haven't seen any sophisticated rebuttals to that. And so I think that that's good news for the biblical creationists. Chromosome 2 fusion mostly overturned, I would argue. We did a whole show together on junk DNA and pseudogenes. And so people can check that out as well. We responded to Getz Gibbon on that. And so tonight we're going to focus on endogenous retroviruses, ERVs. And so, as I pointed out earlier, I've written a book on the topic, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. I've done numerous debates on the topic, both formal and informal. And in this book, I'm comprehensive. I make sure to address exactly why they believe shared endogenous retroviral-like sequences across the biological world, why they believe that's good evidence for common descent, and I make sure to tackle those arguments right here, available now. You can find it on Amazon. Now, one thing that's important, a couple quotes that I think we could live by. Here's one as we move into some of the visuals and arguments here. Believe God more and believe man less. Man is fallible. Man is not infallible like the infinite God. We should be putting our faith and trust in the power of God, not in the wisdom of man. And good science always affirms good scripture. So when we are mature, when we're responsible with our science, it always affirms scripture. I've pointed out before that the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. And when we test its claims, not that it needs to be tested, but when we do test its claims to the scientific data, good science always affirms good scripture. And so, okay, let's move on here. I first got these quotes from Dr. John Sanford, who I highly respect. His work on genetic entropy, an excellent book that I highly recommend. So endogenous retroviruses are not evidence for common descent. Brian, let's go over some of the details. So what are endogenous retroviruses? According to the standard evolutionary story of ERVs, An ERV is a stretch of DNA found in your DNA that got there when one of your ancestors was infected by a retrovirus. And so here's a paper here that explains what ERVs are, at least based on evolutionary philosophy. And so the important question that I want us to focus on and answer here, Brian, in today's show is this. Are ERVs and ERV-like sequences, are they really the leftover remnants of past viral infections, retroviral infections in the past? Or are they mostly created units of DNA function? And that is the important question that we're going to seek to answer tonight. So they look to these DNA units as fossil viruses, and you can find in a number of papers, here's one where they call them exactly that, fossil viruses. They're transmitted vertically through the germline. And so essentially you have an exogenous retrovirus, X meaning from outside, HIV, that would be an exogenous retrovirus. And an ERV would be transmitted vertically. So rather than occurring from outside, like the HIV exogenous retrovirus, endogenous, so endogenous is referring to that which occurs from within. And so basically you'd have to have an exogenous retrovirus infect in the right way, which would be in a germ or reproductive cell. And then from there, it can be passed on vertically. So not horizontally like an exogenous retrovirus from individual to individual, but vertically from parent to offspring to progeny. Most evolutionists will acknowledge that for the most part, these ERV sequences would have occurred millions of years ago. Okay. There are some examples today where they might be occurring, but we're like in koalas, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. So here is the structure of the ERV that I would like us to focus on. First, I got the structure here, but firstly, there are different classes of what's called retrotransposons. Okay. You've got non-LTR retro elements, LTR retro elements. ERVs represent LTR. LTR stands for long terminal repeat. And so ERVs represent about 8% of the human genome, but retro elements in general, the genome comprises over 40% of these elements. Okay. The non-LTR, same things. You got signs, right? Those are loose sequences. So a sign stands, or you got sign and line. Okay. Short interspersed nuclear element or a long interspersed nuclear element. And so the question is, what are these doing here? Because the evolutionist argument is essentially, why did God create biological organisms with viral fossils or viral DNA? And it's a good question. It's a question we're going to answer in this video. So ERVs at the bottom here. Here's the structure. Okay, here's a better visual, I think. You've got LTR on either side. Okay, that's your long terminal repeat. You've got your genes in the middle, so your GAG, Pro, Pol, and ENV. So your ENV is your envelope protein, and your genes code for important enzymes. Okay, now one of these enzymes, and this is all in common with retroviruses, exogenous retroviruses, and the enzyme is reverse transcriptase. So the reverse transcriptase of the retrovirus can actually convert RNA into DNA. So this is the process of transcription, but in reverse transcription. So transcription, you got DNA to RNA to protein, right? DNA transcribed into RNA, which is then translated into a protein. That's the process of gene expression, which is essentially where a gene gets turned on in a cell to make RNA or proteins. But we know that the genome has a lot of function in terms of RNA functions, okay, where you just have DNA transcribed into a functional RNA product. And so with this process of reverse transcription, you basically, rather than DNA to RNA, the retrovirus can convert the RNA into DNA. And so when the viral RNA gets converted into DNA, the DNA can now be read by the host machinery and then transcribed to produce RNA molecules that are viral. So viral RNA molecules. And some of these molecules will actually make their way to the ribosome, where the ribosome will read that genetic information, producing the proteins needed to assemble the viral capsid, as well as these viral enzymes that I'm talking about that are coded or produced by your genes here, GAG, PRO, and POL. One being reverse transcriptase, but the other being integrase. That's how the virus integrates into the genome. And this is basically all encapsulated in the protein capsid along with the RNA molecules. Okay, those are the viral RNA. And so your exogenous retrovirus, this is the way it's built. This is the way its sequence is. And it shares that sequence similarity to your endogenous retrovirus. So your ERV is made up with the same components, LTRs on either side, GAG, POL, PRO, and then ENV. And so, okay, we're going to move in to answering this question. Are these really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? What you're going to see in terms of the answer to that, the counter from the evolutionists is basically a story and rescue devices. That's why I like to say, as a joke, tongue in cheek, cool story, bro. And so, okay, let's move into some of the functions associated with ERVs. Okay, so here's a fascinating paper that I highly recommend everybody read. This is right from the conventional literature. And in my book, I go over dozens and dozens of papers directly from the secular literature. And so you don't even have to run to a creationist website or article to overturn ERVs as evidence for common descent. They're doing it for us right in the conventional literature. And so here's a paper from, I believe, 2022. And let me just see here at the top. I got something covering. There we go. Okay. Okay, now I can see everything. 2021. So switching sides, how endogenous retroviruses protect us from viral infections. Okay, first thing I want to point out is 90% of so-called ERV sequences are not actually true endogenous retroviruses. Okay, so remember how, Brian, I showed the structure of the ERV, LTRs, GAG, POL, PRO, ENV. Well, 90% of your ERVs don't actually represent that. They don't have those genes and those components. The majority of so-called ERVs that we share with the chimpanzee, and so the argument is, why do we share these viral elements with chimpanzees? We must have inherited them from past common ancestors, from a past common ancestor. Okay, well, over 90% are simply solo LTRs. They represent long terminal repeats. They don't have the GAG, the POL, and the ENV components. But it turns out that these solo LTRs actually serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. So you got your full ERVs, which you've only got a few. I think it's a couple hundred max that are shared between humans and chimpanzees. They'll also point to the nested hierarchy. Why do we share more of these with the chimpanzee than we do with a gorilla or an orangutan or a dog? Okay, we'll answer that. But the evolutionists, especially if they're not informed, they think that we share thousands and thousands of full ERVs. No, again, over 90% of them, most of them are just solo LTRs. And so why would we even assume that those were once ERVs? Because they'll say because of mutations and recombination and changes over time, it was once a full ERV, but then it lost those components. It's degraded over time. And now it's just a solo LTR. No, these are just functional stretches of DNA, these solo LTRs. And again, they serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. So why are they shared between humans and chimpanzees and the other primates? Is because they're functional DNA units. Notice this in this paper. This is very interesting. I highly recommend people read the whole thing because it answers the question, why do ERVs look like exogenous retroviruses? Why do they have sequence similarity? Okay, notice this. Long disregarded as junk DNA. So right from the secular literature, they're admitting that they've assumed that ERVs are junk DNA or genomic dark matter. ERVs have turned out to represent important components of the antiviral immune response. So they are active in the immune system and self-stress responses. These remnants of once infectious retroviruses not only regulate cell immune activation, but may even directly target invading viral pathogens. So, Brian, you have antiviral programs on your computer. So, if your computer is infiltrated by a virus, your viral program that's built into your system will detect that and hopefully remove it from the equation. When we have antiviral elements or systems, very sophisticated systems in our genomes that fight off these viruses. This is great design. And this is exactly how we'd expect a designer to help in terms of defense with biological organisms. And many of these functions require the sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses to carry out their roles. Okay, we'll get more into that later. Notice this. One focus will be on recent advances in the role of ERVs as regulators of antiviral gene expression. I find this to be a very fascinating paper as well. I recommend everybody save this one. Notice this. As we have summarized in this review, HERVs just stands for human ERVs, appear to play important roles in physiology, fetal development, and human evolution. Of course, the human evolution would mostly pertain to the fact that some of these retrotransposons, they can help generate genetic diversity. That's why some in the creationist world, they call them variation-inducing genetic elements. That doesn't mean, see, when they say evolution, they will sometimes mean, well, the theory of common descent, large scale evolution. Well, if by evolution you just mean change over time, change in allele frequencies and populations over generations, we're not going to have a problem with that, as you know, Brian. Okay. We believe in microevolutionary variations within species. So notice this right here. If the accidental infection of a mammalian ancestor by an exogenous. Remember earlier we talked about X versus endogenous. So the exogenous retrovirus would be occurring from outside. So an organism is hit with an external retrovirus, and then it infiltrates in a germ cell, and then it can be passed on vertically, and then every single cell of the progeny will have it, and it can be passed on from there as an endogenous retrovirus. So notice this. The placenta and the mammals that produce it, including humans, would have never existed. I like to exist. Brian, I know you like to exist. Hopefully the evolutionists that are watching this show like to exist. So this means these are necessary for our existence. Why do all modes of transportation have an engine in common? Well, it's because if you don't have an engine in your car, the car is probably not going to go very far. You need an engine for the car to do what it was designed to do. And we need these endogenous retroviruses to survive. And so without ERVs, the placenta, which as we know is critical to pregnancy and embryological development, would simply not work. We would not exist. And so they are essential for life. And they don't just assist in embryological development and embryonic immune systems. They also work in our immune systems after we're born. As in, our immune system pathways are literally dependent upon enzymes that are generated by endogenous retroviral-like sequences. And during embryological development, the growing baby, its defense are these ERVs. And so these ERVs are actually safeguarding the growing baby from invading pathogens. And so a lot of ERVs, they're only functional or turned on during various stages of the developmental process, and then they're turned off. And so just because an ERV is turned off or silent or not performing a function at a certain time, it doesn't mean it's non-functional. It just means it's done its job. And we could go over function after function that relates to that. So, okay, why do we share many of these ERVs with the chimpanzee and other primates? It's like asking the question, why do Dodge, Volkswagen, Ford, and GM vehicles share engines in common? It's good design. These are necessary. Okay, notice this one: beneficial role of human ERVs. Human endogenous retroviruses. And notice this is all from the conventional literature. Have recently been suggested as mediators of normal biological processes, such as cell differentiation and again, regulation of gene expression, which we talked about earlier, is that important process where a gene is turned on in a cell to either make an RNA or a protein. Very important functional roles. We understand that ERVs can act as promoters, enhancers, and even transcription start sites for gene expression. And getting more into, so I want to get to a different slideshow here because there exists paper after paper, as I've said. But I wanted to focus more on this. So I've done a deep study into this paper that we were talking about earlier, switching sides, how ERVs protect us from viral infections. You can find all your answers to the evolutionary argument for ERVs in this paper, because the more we discover about the genome and how sophisticated it is, the more functions we discover. Okay. So notice what I was saying earlier about the solo LTRs. This is not me making things up. This is directly from, again, the secular literature. Intriguingly, almost 90% of all HERVs represent what? So-called solo LTRs. These HERVs lost the prototypical retroviral genes GAG, POL, and ENV. And Brian, you're really good at this in terms of recognizing presuppositions and assumptions. Notice in their papers, as creationists, we read these papers, but we got to get rid of the fluff. We got to recognize what's based on an evolutionary presupposition, what's empirical, what's not. And so they're assuming that these solo LTRs were once full ERVs. But wait a minute. We now know that these long terminal repeats serve a functional role in the genome where they act in gene regulation. And these can function as promoters and serve as transcription factor binding sites. And so, yeah, if you were a designer, you could incorporate similarities to the long terminal repeat to genomes of eukaryotic organisms because they have properties that make them ideally suited for what? Promoter sequences. And so these are critical for transcription, and they serve as promoter sequences that serve as binding sites for RNA polymerase. Okay, so no, we're not just going to assume what the evolutionist assumes, that these were once part of an ERV and they've been degraded over time. Okay, notice here, right from the secular literature, the endogenous LTRs mentioned above all act as enhancers. Is this not what I've been saying? And may increase antiviral gene expression in response to viral infection. And so these all function and help in fighting off viral infections. They are our defense systems in many ways. And so right here is the paper again that I highly recommend people check out, antiviral protectors. And see, here's the thing. Your evolutionists, their main argument is, why do ERVs and ERV-like sequences like the LTRs, why do they share sequence similarity with exogenous retroviruses? Because they have to. They require that sequence similarity to carry out these roles. And this brings us to an even bigger question, which we could do an entire show on. So I'll just give a teaser, a sneak preview, is the question of, where did viruses come from? Where did retroviruses come from in the first place? How did they evolve? What's their origin? Because we know that retroviruses actually require hosts to replicate. So what came first, the host or the retrovirus? If the retrovirus came first, where's the host? Where's the cell to replicate? And so as creationists, we have an excellent explanation, which many in the secular camp are actually resorting to now as well, the escapee hypothesis that these retroviruses, the harmful retroviruses, have originated from host genomes. And so this is what I would argue as a biblical creationist, that your exogenous retroviruses, your harmful ones, have originated from healthy cells. maybe healthy ERV or retrotransposons, and they've managed to escape the host cell, cross species where they're now harmful. Okay, so there's a lot that have to do with that, but that would also explain why they look the way they do. Okay, and that's an excellent explanation for the origin of retroviruses, which the evolutionary community lacks. So notice this. ERVs have become, so notice how they say become. No, ERVs were front loaded by God at the beginning to be integral parts of immune defense mechanisms and help to fight off invading viral pathogens. Okay. And so each part of your ERV, your GAG, your POL, your ENV proteins, they participate in these functional roles. Notice this. ENV proteins can also directly inhibit viral infection, because a lot of evolutionists, their rescue device is, well, the ERV is not functional. It's just certain parts of it. No, every aspect of that would be like saying the being, the element that is a human being, me. My arms are functional. Maybe my legs are functional. Other parts are. No, the entire unit of a human being is functional. The entire unit of an ERV, whether it's the full unit or just a solo LTR, they are functional. They're necessary. Very bad rescue devices from these evolutionists because they don't want to tap both, because this is supposedly their best argument for common descent. So your ENV proteins, they help with this function of blocking the harmful effects of exogenous retroviruses. Okay. Early reports of receptor interference date back to the 1960s, when several groups demonstrated that ENV proteins, okay, they've induced resistance to exogenous viruses. So these elements are in the genome and they are helping in terms of resisting, invading harmful retroviruses. The GAG proteins, they can also restrict retroviral replication. So the whole point of these slides and these excerpts is just showing that every aspect of the ERV is functional and necessary. And so we could talk about this all day. One of your main arguments from more informed evolutionists like biologists, Dr. Dan Stern-Cardy now, they like to say, okay, fine. We've got these transcribed ERVs. We got these ERVs that have certain components that are functional. Okay, what about the transcriptionally silent ones? What about the ones that, according to them, lack certain important components? Okay, well, notice this. We've left no stone unturned. Even transcriptionally silent ERVs are functional. That's it. It's done, guys. ERVs are not a good argument for evolution. Notice this, right from the conventional literature. Nevertheless, transcriptionally silent ERVs can also provide a selection advantage to the host. For example, the presence of repetitive ERV elements may promote what? Recombination. That's amazing. That's what we would expect in light of design diversity and created heterozygosity. Processes that increase the number and or allelic variety of host genes. Notice this, increasing knowledge. Our knowledge about endogenous retroviral elements involved in cell immune responses is constantly increasing. It's premature to look to DNA elements like pseudogenes, allele sequences, these various classes of retrotransposons and retroelements, and argue that they're non-functional evolutionary leftovers, when even the secular scientific community is admitting that our knowledge is increasing and we're discovering more and more functional roles associated with ERVs. And even when it comes to the nested hierarchy, well, firstly, if they are mostly created units of DNA function, then of course we're going to share more with the chimpanzee than we do with a dog or even orangutan. A human and a chimpanzee look more alike anyways. You're going to find a natural nested hierarchy in design modes of transportation where you have a car like a sedan that looks more and shares a lot more with a hatchback than the car like the sedan and the hatchback share with a semi-tractor trailer or a boat. That's just naturally expected. Okay. We are going to be, as humans, more similar to some creatures like a chimpanzee and less similar to other creatures like a fish or a dog, because we're all made with the same components: RNA, DNA, proteins, similarities in morphology, physiology. But even in the so-called nested hierarchy, notice this paper, there are inconsistencies. A HERV K provirus in chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas, but not in humans. These observations provide very strong evidence that for some fraction of the genome, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas are more closely related to each other than they are to humans. They like to cherry pick. Okay. And so there again, paper after paper. Notice just on this slide alone, here's 3 for you. Retroviral promoters in the human genome. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses and immune response. Here's the thing. These papers will oftentimes say co-option. These functions were co-opted, or they've evolved through beneficial mutation accumulation. I challenge the evolutionists to show me an example of a non-functional ERV going from non-functional to something with an essential function like embryological development or functional in the placenta. I want to see that in real time, or else this is just a story. This is just evolutionary philosophy. If viral DNA is randomly or non-randomly inserted into a cell, it's more likely to cause harm than lead to a novel function. If I was blindfolded and I was painting a picture, now I put a blindfold on and I start applying random brush strokes to the painting. Am I going to make the painting better, Brian? No, I'm going to make the painting worse. Notice this on the slide, paper after paper. The evolutionists love when I say that, but it's true. There's one here that I wanted to highlight right here. Again, they admit, far from being junk DNA, they are admitting that they did not predict these incredible functions for these DNA elements. The pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to influence genes in chromatin. Then they'll ask, oh, well, what about the so-called shared mutations within the ERV sequences? Well, firstly, it is the evolutionary community that assumes all DNA differences, all differences within the genomes of living organisms are the result of mutations and damage over time. Sure, there are mutations, of course, but we also know that a lot of these DNA differences or so-called discrepancies aren't actually the result of mutations, but they are design differences. Okay. The creationist looks to the majority of DNA differences in the genomes of living organisms, as being the result of design. That's what's called the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Heterozygosity is just a fancy way of saying a state of DNA diversity, right? This goes back to basic genetics and basic alleles, an allele being a genetic variant. You got capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Okay, you'd be genetically heterozygous. If you were capital A, capital A, capital B, you'd be genetically homogeneous. So if you apply this logic, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, apply that logic to millions of positions within the genome, millions of genetic locations, you have unlimited potential for DNA variation, chromosomal combinations, novel chromosomal combinations, and diversity. Okay. And so, no, we're not just going to automatically assume that what they're pointing to is actually a mutation, but it also assumes a couple of things. Okay. The evolutionists, firstly, they assume that ERVs are non-functional. We've destroyed that. They assume that the insertion mechanism is random and that the mutational events taking place are random. Okay. You can line up a whole bunch of cars that exist in the same environment, and you're going to find rust marks, a lot of rust marks in the exact same spot. It's not because they inherited those rust marks from a common Arctic ancestor or a skateboard. It's because we exist in the same environments. We're going to be subject to the same problems. And we know there are mutational hotspots. There are certain genetic elements, like retroviruses have a fast mutation rate. And so, yeah, a lot of mutations could be accumulated independently and shared, but not become of common ancestry. But a lot of what they say are mutations are not actually mutations. They reflect the functional requirements or the uniqueness in function across different biological organisms. Anyways, I got hundreds of slides, brother, but I wanted to wrap it up there. so I'm going to stop the screen share.
All right, yeah, I have some questions actually. Uh, couple. Let me ask you a question. On the DNA, is it my understanding? Because I was reading this also in your ERV handbook. They consider the 8% ERVs that are found in us. Do they consider it part of what they call junk DNA? Is that correct?
Right. As you can see in a lot of the papers, they'll say once assumed to be junk DNA, or you'll find, because people like Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal and these evolutionary biologists that have so much invested in being related to whales and pine trees, they will oftentimes assert that these functions were expected. But I could show you paper after paper where they admit these functions were unexpected. They use the words unexpected, surprised, and then they'll just throw in co-opted. Oh, this was co-opted or that function was co-opted, but they provide no real empirical evidence for that co-option. And so, yes, they largely assume, they still assume that the majority of the genome is non-functional, it's junk. And that's why I'd recommend people check out, Brian, my brother, our video we did together on junk DNA, because we dismantled all of their possible responses to junk DNA and really demonstrated that junk DNA is junk science.
What do they mean by co-opted?
So co-option would be, okay, so here's how the story goes. Basically, an exogenous retrovirus will infect, right? Like HIV is not passed on because it's infected through somatic cells. It's passed on horizontally. But if an exogenous retrovirus infects in the germ cell line, a reproductive cell, well, now it can be passed on. So now it's passed on to progeny, it's passed on vertically. And so now the progeny, every single one of its cells have that viral DNA. Well, what needs to happen over time is mutations need to wipe away or clear out any harmful components or effects of that retrovirus. And then it needs to acquire a function either through beneficial mutations or the host, the cell, can essentially co-opt it, like maybe an LTR, to function as a promoter or an enhancer. So it's basically saying, hey, this new DNA is part of the system, so let's use it for something. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yes. Um, Also, another thing that kind of stood out to me when you were describing this on as far as function and the DNA having function. Some of these functions, so it's not just the fact that it's have functions. Some of the types of functions that they have require their existence in the genome. Like you said that we would not be able to exist without it or that are essential in embryological development and that sort of thing. And so, would you look at that as like evidence that these were already there prior to any kind of germline infections? Because the evolutionary assumption would be that they didn't exist, but then because of exogenous retroviruses affecting the gene, the gene in reproduction, right? And that it could be passed on. So it wasn't there previously. But if they need to be there in order for life to exist or for embryological development, would you see that as strong evidence that it was already in existence?
Yes, I think with the design diversity model, which I think we both would hold to, God not only created Adam and Eve and the original created archetypes with pre-existing levels of genetic diversity, but also with many functional DNA elements like pseudogenes, which they call pseudo. See, here's the thing: the ERV did not call itself an ERV. The ERV unit did not say, I'm an endogenous retrovirus. Evolution is assuming that they really are the ancient remnants of past viral infections. Name them ERVs. I don't even like the name. I like created unit of DNA function. So God would have front loaded organisms in the beginning with these functional DNA units to operate in many ways, determining cell types, acting in cell stress responses, fighting off invading viruses, functioning in the embryological development, like you said, in the placenta. These are necessary functions. And so is it a surprise that we share these elements with all of the biological world? I want to point this out because there is an amazing functional role associated with these ERVs, brother, that they've discovered. So what I like to say in terms of which ones are designed and created versus which ones are true ERVs. This is what your more informed evolutionists, your PhDs, will ask. Well, how do we know which ones are which? Well, if everybody has them, so if they're fixed, let's say we have an ERV, all humans have it, the chimpanzees have it, they function in the embryo. That's a created ERV. But you have some ERVs that are unfixed. This goes back to population genetics, genetics in general. Unfixed means only a small subset of the population has them. I would argue those are probably not functional. They're most likely disease causing because it's not unrealistic that an exogenous retrovirus would infiltrate in the germ cell line and be passed on. But chances of it becoming spread into all people and then becoming functional, highly unlikely. So that's how I would determine what's functional and what's not. But here's an amazing function that they've discovered, okay? So there are koala bears. They have new ERVs. If I'm not mistaken, I think they're called KORVs. Okay. Now there's pre-existing ERVs. So ones that are fixed, they're pre-existing. They're not new. They're not from exogenous retroviral infection. They're actually disrupting the endogenization process from these new infections. Okay. And so it looks like the pre-existing ERVs, the ones that I would argue are designed and created, they also help and act to fight off or to prevent true endogenous retroviruses from proliferating. And so there's another amazing functional role associated with this. So yes, there are true ERVs, Brian. They're not going to be essential in function like embryological development. They're not going to be fixed where everybody has them. Okay. And they're most likely going to be disease causing. And that's an active research project I have right now. And that would be the best answer I have for that, brother.
So you would consider the ones that the evolutionists like to point to as artificial ERVs, kind of thing, because they're not really true ERVs in that sense.
You got it. I wouldn't even call them ERVs. They're there, they're in place, they're tightly integrated, they're irreducibly complex with their functions. And that's why I say to somebody who would say, well, how come these can't evolve these functions like an embryological development or helping to determine cell types, gene expression, gene regulation? It's like, well, if you were to randomly insert viral DNA into your cell or into a cell of a biological organism, it's more likely to break information. It's more likely to disrupt functionality, not lead to a new function. Does that make sense, brother?
And if I understood from your ERV handbook, you said that one of the reasons why they thought that these were ERVs is from the structure. Is the structure is the way the DNA, I guess, is designed here. And they say it's similar to ERVs. Is that correct?
Right. That's why the beginning of my presentation, I know it's technical, can be long-winded, but I focused on the structure just so people know exactly why evolutionists do believe that these are the ancient remnants of past viral infections. It's largely because of the structure. So your retrovirus is built with the LTRs on both sides, your GAG, POL, ENV components, okay, in the middle, your genes that code for important enzymes like reverse transcriptase, integrase being another one. And so, but as I pointed out, as you can see in these papers, the functional roles associated with ERV elements are dependent upon those shared components. So one amazing function, and cancer researchers are now looking to this to fight off tumors, Brian, and this answers this question and dismantles this argument. And so transcribed ERVs, okay, they actually give the cell the appearance of being invaded by a harmful retrovirus. Okay. There's what's called the guardian of the genome. It's called the P53 protein, incredibly sophisticated protein, extremely important to the health of an organism. And this process is mediated by the P53 protein. It's called viral mimicry. So basically, these ERVs are mimicking harmful viruses. And so it stimulates P53 activity that gets the immune system to target that cell with destruction, that cell being a tumor cell. And so this can destroy tumors. The only reason this is possible is because the ERV that's mimicking the bad virus looks like the bad virus, viral mimicry. And so it has to look like the retrovirus to do that job. It's like people like these movies where you get a detective or police officer that infiltrates the mob, right? Okay, so they infiltrate the mob. They have to mimic the mob. They have to go in and look like the part. They got to go in and look like somebody who's in the mob to be a spy or to infiltrate and get information. If they went in their detective uniform or they went in with their police uniform, name tag Brian or Bob, they're not going to get very far. They're probably going to get killed right away. They got to look the part. And that's the same thing with these ERVs. They got to look the part to carry out those operational roles.
Right. Um, and I have a question. Do see how I sent you a question earlier about has the evolutionists ever thought that maybe the try to argue for these functionality as a result of like natural selection or anything like that?
Yeah, they would argue that these functions came about through co-option, like the with the embryological development. Uh, we can get into a whole show on that, but they basically believe a part of the ERV was borrowed to help with that, with the evolution of mammals. Okay, with the placenta. So the genomes, they'll argue, are basically taking certain parts or components of the ERV and then utilizing them for functional roles, or beneficial mutations will accumulate in these sequences over time and become functional. But the thing is, these functions are so widespread. So, for example, with the LTRs, they would have to argue basically that these solo LTRs are gaining these functions in just the right way and just the right spot over and over and over again. If it was just one or two, okay, maybe. It's so widespread that it goes against logic. It goes against what we know about basic genetics and what is and what isn't possible. And so it's the analogy I used earlier. If I'm doing a beautiful painting and then I were to blindfold myself and just start applying random brush strokes to that painting, am I going to make the painting any better? Probably going to make it worse, right?
All right. Well,
So, you know,
some kinds
mutations
of
and
painting.
co-option, yeah, I guess it depends how good the painting was in the first place. But so the point is, yeah, these rescue devices, they mainly don't work is because they're not demonstrating it in a lab. They're not showing or providing any real empirical evidence for this occurring.
I'm curious that we often say that there is no evidence for Darwinian evolution. And I still consider that because the ERLVs sound to me, and it sounds to me like you're saying as well, that this is actually evidence for design because they have a function, and these functions are requiring um, DNA elements to be there as well for the organism. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to assume that they was never there at one point or another. So do you see this as evidence of design, and you would not argue this is evidence for evolutionary view because evolutionary view would require these to be functionalist if you take their what they're arguing, you know, to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, because certain functions, like for example, the function in the without retroviruses, right? These ERVs, we would not, human beings wouldn't have placentas. and therefore we would not be bearing live young. And so reproduction is important. The placenta is an essential biological structure for the development of a human being, and it has different structures that allow for circulation, continual circulation between mother and baby. That's how nutrients and gases and certain waste products are all circulated from mother to baby, is based on the placenta and its structure. And this is all due to an endogenous retrovirus. And so, yes, I think it's incredible evidence for design. The evolutionary community has not demonstrated how these functions can come about, these necessary functions. And so the evolutionary community wants to argue that, okay, we share ERVs with primates and other organisms because we inherited them from common ancestors, and those common ancestors were hit with exogenous retroviral infection that became endogenized and passed on generation after generation. But the thing is, these functional roles help us answer the question that I asked in the beginning. Are these really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? And I would argue that they are mostly created units of DNA function, at least the fixed functional ones. Your unfixed ones, they probably represent true ERVs. And that's fine. That's what we would expect since the flood. And the flood was a disaster. The environment shifted. I could imagine a lot going on immediately post flood in terms of viral infections and the rapid degradation of the genomes, which I think applies to the declining lifespans as well. And Brian, it all goes back to the larger question that I asked. What is the origin of retroviruses? The evolutionary community can't answer that. Retroviruses require a host to replicate, right? So what came first? The host or the retrovirus? We have an answer. God front loaded living organisms with ERVs, healthy, functional ERVs. But over time, because of the fall, because of death, extinction, mutation accumulation, degradation, what happened? Well, errors in the packaging process, mutation accumulation. These retroviruses essentially escaped and they've crossed species. That's why you get a virus that's not necessarily harmful in its host, but once it crosses into another host, it burns hot and fast because that immune system of that host can't regulate the virus. And so you get all these negative symptoms. And so we can take whatever exogenous retrovirus you want to look at, even HIV, and you can track back and find where it originally escaped from or came from. And so we have an answer to the bigger picture question. And therefore, I think the design hypothesis, Brian, provides us the best explanation for both the origin of retroviruses and what exactly are ERVs.
I was watching a video the other day that mentioned something about that something that's supposed to get rid of um, viruses that affect at least the first couple generations. It was called apoptosis. Have you heard of that?
Apoptosis. Yes.
Yes, yes.
Cell death. Yeah.
Okay, could you explain that? And do you think that that would be a problem from the idea of these ERVs being in a ancient ancestry line like that?
Yeah, because if you think about it, apparently millions of years ago, these early primates are just bombarded with all of these exogenous retroviruses infecting, many of them being passed on vertically. Yeah, there's built-in cellular mechanisms and systems, apoptosis being one of them, that is going to destroy those viruses, destroy the cells. You'd think natural selection would actually get rid of these so-called fossil viruses. They're certainly not going to be beneficial right away. They're going to have to be co-opted or acquire these functions, these novel functions over time. And so selection should weed them out. Again, you got apoptosis, which would basically just destroy these cells that are experiencing these viral infections, if I remember correctly how that mechanism works. And so, yes, I think there are many problems associated with. And here's the thing: these ERVs and ERV-like sequences, they're within this 80% genomic activity that we know exists. And so even if we don't necessarily know the function of a certain endogenous retrovirus, that doesn't mean that it's non-functional. It just means that we're in the beginning stages of understanding the DNA language. Because if all of these were truly non-functional and all of this activity was just spurious, well, as we discussed in our junk DNA video, brother, that would be incredibly wasteful of energy and resources for the cell. And so over time, those evolutionary leftovers and viral fossils should be weeded out. That would be good. That would be a good thing for selection to do. So the fact that they're there suggests that they're functional, that they're useful.
Right. Well, time's kind of running away with us. Is there any final words that you want to add? Anything additional that you would like to add to this discussion, or
Sure,
leave
yeah.
with?
I like to leave no stone unturned. And the evolutionists, their main argument is basically, okay, what about these unfixed ERVs? There's one paper on human endogenous retroviruses where just a small set of humans have a certain ERV. I am not saying, and I think you've gathered this too, I'm not saying every single ERV is a created unit of DNA function. I recognize the fact that over time, since the flood or since creation, an exogenous retrovirus could escape the genome, move into another host, maybe move into another host from there, hit a germ cell line, and be passed on vertically to become an ERV. But I wouldn't expect those to become highly functional. I also wouldn't expect those to become fixed meaning drift into every single individual in the population. That's where research projects come into play. I have an active research project currently when it comes to ERVs and figuring out which ones are created, which ones are not. A real simple answer for somebody who wants to ask you that question is if it's fixed, if it's functional, if it's not disease causing, it's probably designed and created. If it's not fixed, if it's disease causing, if it's not functional in, let's say, the embryo or the placenta, which is essential, okay, then it's probably a true ERV. And so, yeah, there are some true ERVs, but the majority, especially the ones that are shared between humans and chimps, or humans, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, those are created. And we can usually figure that out based on function and the frequency that they occur.
That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. And thank you for taking the time to discuss ERVs with
Hey,
us. ERV, before I met you, I didn't even know what an ERV was.
yeah,
So I've never actually even heard of an ERV. And then I
it
started watching your channel, and you do a lot of programs on there on ERVs, and that's when I became aware of it. And then I had other evolutionists that would bring it up to me, and I was like, okay, maybe it's time I actually take it seriously and look into it.
that's what I love about your channel and your ministry. One of the many things, brother, is you are very similar to me in terms of mindset. You want to leave no stone unturned. If the evolutionist thinks they got a line of evidence for their position, let's address it. That's why I've dedicated so much time to ERVs, is because most of your major evolutionist channels, what do they say is the best evidence for evolution? Over and over again. ERVs, ERVs. I just responded to Vice Rhino, popular evolutionist YouTube, and he said at the beginning of his video, this is probably the best evidence for evolution. Okay, let's engage it and let's see. And what have we seen? This is just more evidence for design, isn't it, Brian?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like evidence for Darwinian evolution because there's all kinds of issues involved, like the fact that, like we said, we have processes that would eliminate it if it was like a fixed in an ancestry type situation that they're proposing. You got functionality of the ERVs. They're highly functional, and even the types of functions are in such a way that would that the idea that they could not have existed at one time doesn't seem very uh, liable.
That's right. And remember, when it comes to, because you'll see, let's say you were to talk to an evolutionary biologist, they're going to ask you, oh, well, what about the mutations? What about the shared mutations in the ERV elements? But as we pointed out, we're leaving no stone unturned, Brian. It's the evolutionary community that assumes that all of these DNA discrepancies or DNA differences are the result of mutations where we as creationists, we assume that the vast majority of DNA diversity is a result of design. And so many of the so-called shared mutations may not actually be mutations and may simply reflect functional units. And so what's a prediction we can make based on that hypothesis? Function, that we'll find function. And we keep confirming that month after month, brother.
Awesome. All right. Again, thank you for taking this time to discuss this with us. And I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate your ministry. You've done a lot. You got a lot of topics that you discuss on your channel. You discuss a lot more topics on your channel than I do on mine. Um, I, including eschatology, which I don't really deal with eschatology much. I did think about doing a prophecy series before, though. So,
That'd be cool.
maybe I'll enter that kind of discussion eventually, but I usually try not to go too far into eschatology.
Well, you and I,
Uh,
we did that good discussion on Daniel's 70th week
yeah,
with
yeah, on the
with
open
the
mic
skeptic.
night.
That was good.
Yeah, yeah, that was awesome. All right. Thank you again, Donnie. I have to get going, and I am sorry for your technical difficulties. You do glitch a little bit, just let you know. Just I don't know if you want to try to fix that later. But
Sure.
thank you again, and I will see you next time.
Okay, Brian, I appreciate you having me. God bless you, brother.
God bless you. Thank you for watching Apologetics 101 and our discussion on ERVs. I thank Donnie very much. And also, if you want to subscribe to Donnie's channel, he has a YouTube channel called Standing for Truth. Make sure you subscribe to his channel. I will be linking his YouTube channel as well as his website and where you can find his ERV book if you want to purchase it down below in the description box. Um, I do plan on doing another episode of the Tompkins controversy. It's already planned up. It's just a matter of finding the time to actually do that specific recording. It's called The Unalienable Regions of the Genome, and we're going to be dealing with the differences that are not aligning in BLAST, and we're going to be dealing with that. I've done some experiments. I'm actually working on an experiment right now, and we'll see how everything turns out. But I don't. It's just a question of having time because I am trying to also get an interview with Carl Werner. And I actually have an interview scheduled also for Dr. Jason Lyell to come back on my channel on August 7th. So there's a lot of stuff in store, a lot of pre-planned episodes of Apologetics 101 coming up. And don't forget to support me on Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Make sure you hit that notification bell. Drop me a comment below. And I'll see you on the next one.